So I mentioned the sediment moving down, but I'm going to use a picture, an interesting picture. Here's the not quite built, the Washington Monument with some ponds. It's the Potomac River. Notice how close the Potomac River is to the base of the Washington Monument. Here's the Capitol. This picture is interesting because it was drawn by the U.S. Army Balloon Corps in 1880. This is 1880 DC. They were drawing it to show how important Balloon Corps was, the aerial images they could take if you're for warfare, being able to look at your enemy in distance. But they captured the half-built Washington Monument and the ponds and this how close it was to the shoreline. Now, just to show you the sediment, this is a map of most of the District of Columbia, the Potomac and Anacostia. But the stippled areas are the sediment that came down and filled in the rivers. Actually, it closed up the river. A plan was made to dredge the river and put the spoils on the side. So that's the current configuration. Actually, National Airport was added a little bit after that bad Air Florida crash. But this is basically the land now. But again, the Washington Monument was built just hundreds of feet from the shore. Now it's about a mile to the shore. And again, here's another rare photograph of the half-built Washington Monument. And you see the river coming up close to it. I got to, as a fisheries biologist, have to spend a little time on the ponds. The ponds were there. They held carp because the German immigrants really wanted carp because that was part of their farm culture in Germany. Carp are from Asia, but they've been in Europe for hundreds of years before this. They wanted carp so they could put them in their farm ponds as a food source. So they brought carp to the United States. They kept them in these ponds. The ponds were being raided by people that they actually got the National Guard to guard the ponds to keep people from stealing the carp out of the pond. But what I'm showing you the picture, because look at the river behind it. There's this Washington Monument there and the river behind it. So here's a picture taken from the top of the Washington Monument, the completed Washington Monument. So all this area that I'm showing here that's green, that's added land. That's the sediment that came down from the mountains of West Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia from that clear cut. They came down and they made some land out of it. But this was all water. You know, in 1880 it was all water. There's the Washington, the Lincoln Memorial built on the fairly recently done. Also, if you go down to the tidal basin and the Jefferson Memorial and Haynes Point, that's all that sediment that washed down from the mountaintops. And I'll talk a minute about some other critters, important critters that we've kind of forgotten about. Beaver. They were once beaver all over the place. There's more beaver in the East Coast than in the Midwest or West Coast, but we've forgotten about the beaver and their importance. They've been extirpated for so long. Extirpated means pretty much eliminated from the landscape for so long. They're very important to the ecology of the river, and they're important. I've tried to convince Maryland to make it one of their state animals, because the colony of Maryland was created when Lord Calvert was looking for how we're going to economically, pay for this colony we're going to start. Well, he knew a person that had traded furs with the Indians, and the trade netted this man what's the equivalent of $5 million today. So as Calvert said, the fur trade was the key to creating the new colony, and that he organized where furs alone would largely requite the adventure. The furs would pay for the adventure, and then the Ark of the Dove sailed in 1634. So without beaver trade, Maryland would not have existed as a colony and not a state, and that was freedom of religion too. So the beaver trade was really important, and actually Henry Fleet, he reported that the Indian village, the English didn't trap the beaver, the Native Americans, they traded goods, beads, hatchets, guns even with the Indians for the beaver pelts. But the Anacostia, where the Nacotchtank Indians lived, he says they were gone, the beaver were gone. That's probably the first river in America that lost its beaver population. But soon the whole East Coast, they were pretty much eradicated for beaver trade. Why was the beaver pelt so important? That's what they made. They used the felt. They didn't really use the hide so much. They used the felt to make clothing, and that was a kind of a waterproof fabric. It was the Gore-Tex of its day. That waterproof fabric for hats, for clothing was very important, especially when you're out on horseback, you're walking a lot, you're not riding around in a car in those days, then the beaver felt was very important. So when the beaver were eliminated, it was another one of the ills that befell this area. Now there was the logging, the loss of the tree cover, but the loss of beavers and the habitat that they made, they're very important to a lot of critters. In fact, the animals that are most affected by human population changes to the environment, are the creatures of the water. If you look at the percentage of extinction rates, if you look at the extinction rates of North American animals, it's the fish, crayfish, mussels, the snails, and the amphibians. This group is much higher, they're on extinction rates much higher than the land animals. And a lot of that is due to the loss of the beaver habitat that they made. They're important to early mussels. For instance, we've lost a lot of species of mussels. They're one of the highest extinction rates because of the loss of the beaver habitat. And back to fish, the iconic fish of the Potomac is the smallmouth bass. However, that's not a native fish of the Potomac. It was introduced to the Potomac along with 36 other non-native fish in our history. It was introduced in 1854 by William Shriver of Wheeling, Virginia at the time. It was West Virginia now. But he introduced, in his words, about 30 of Ohio fish that he put on a train car. Again, they had steam trains, so they had a water car behind the engine, and he just put a basket of fish into the water car to keep them alive. And he introduced them at Cumberland, Maryland in 1854. In less than a decade, the smallmouth bass, those 30 fish, had spread all over the Potomac, up the Shenandoah, up the tributaries, and they were reported as averaging 4 pounds each, which is a big smallmouth. And that caught the attention of a lot of recreational and commercial fishermen. Again, there was still commercial fishing going on in the Potomac upstream. In 1864, the Maryland, recognizing this Potomac, they got smallmouth from the Potomac River and introduced them into stocking ponds, and then stocked other rivers in the state of Maryland with these smallmouth from the Potomac River. In 1869, Pennsylvania anglers introduced smallmouth bass to the Susquehanna River at Harrisonburg. They probably came from the Potomac as well, commercial fishermen that worked in the Potomac. Because to give you an example, Thaddeus Norris, he wrote The American Angler. In 1870, he purchased 706 smallmouth bass at Harper's Ferry from these watermen that were here. Back to fish again, I want to talk about the smallmouth bass, an iconic fish of the Potomac. However, it's not a native fish. It was introduced along with 36 other fish, but I'll focus on the smallmouth bass. It was introduced in the Potomac in 1854 by William Shriver from Wheeling, West Virginia, who wrote in a letter that he introduced about 30 of these fish from the Ohio River into the C&O Canal in Cumberland. And in less than a decade, those 30 fish they'd spread all over the Potomac, Shenandoah, all these tributaries, and they were averaging 4 pounds. That's a big smallmouth bass. That caught the attention of a lot of fishermen, both recreational and commercial. And so in 1864, Maryland went to the Potomac and got smallmouth bass that they introduced to other rivers in Maryland. So that's where all of the smallmouth in Maryland come from. In 1869, Pennsylvania anglers, similarly interested, introduced smallmouth bass, which were described as being caught in the Potomac, they introduced them to the Susquehanna River at Harrisonburg. That's from Lefty Cray, an angler. His father told him they went to the Harper's Ferry to get them. Importantly, in 1870, Thaddeus Norris, who was the author of American Angler, he purchased 706 smallmouth bass. So that wasn't from just anglers, that's from commercial fishermen at Harper's Ferry, and stocked them into the Delaware River at Easton, and this was later repeated in the Lehigh, Schuylkill, and other rivers. So due to the north-south orientation of the Susquehanna and Delaware rivers, it's very likely that other rivers to the east got their smallmouth from those rivers and then introduced them like into, Maine, Massachusetts, all that area there. They have smallmouth bass, but they likely came from similar stocking of adjacent rivers. So millions of smallmouth bass in the east descended from just 30 fish that were introduced into the Potomac. And that's important, like the finding of intersex in the Potomac River, where some of the males had eggs in them. But if you just have 30 fish, that's a real kind of concentration of genetic material. So that could have been partly due to that versus contaminants. Should be considered for that. Besides beaver, another important animal for the fur trade were the white-tailed deer. Think of Daniel Boone. He noted also that winter hides were inferior and the summer hides of deer were the best hides, which I thought was curious. But by the 1800s, late 1800s, they pretty much hunted them to extinction in this area. it became illegal to hunt deer in Maryland in 1902 because there were only 300 deer in the entire state. That's the only state that I know of that took track of them. But in West Virginia and Virginia and Pennsylvania portions of the Potomac, there were no deer. There were no deer in the Shenandoah National Park when it was established. So all the states had stocking programs where they brought deer back and brought them back. So it's interesting. We went from just 100 years ago, there were no deer at all around this area. Now we have an overabundance of deer. So we can change things fairly rapidly when we put our minds to it. Part of our environmental history that's not well recognized is the bison and elk lived here as well. Just to the east of me is Elk Ridge, part of the extended Blue Ridge above Harper's Ferry. Elk Ridge, named after elk that lived in the East Coast. Similarly, bison were in this area. I tried to get the National Conservation Training Center to have a little herd of bison on their park, where when people come there from around the United States, they'd see bison there, and they go, "Why do you have a bison? They're Western." They go, "No, they were Eastern. They're from here as well as the West." And being a member of the Audubon Society, the Potomac Valley Audubon in particular, I talked about the passenger pigeon, which John Audubon said he estimated that they were the most numerous bird on Earth, that they made up about 2/3 of the birds in North America. So they were so thick they flew in these big flocks, and they went extinct. By 1914 they were extinct. Part of the reason for their extinction, certainly hunting and stuff, was one of the reasons. But remember that picture I showed you of the forest? Well, the passenger pigeon's area of nesting is in this forest, and when we clear cut the forest, we eliminated their nesting area. So that was probably the most significant thing that led to their extinction, was the loss of habitat. And this is a flock of geese. I'm going to talk about them in a second, but I'll mention about the passenger pigeon. Again, the passenger pigeons were very important. There's huge flocks in nutrient cycling. Wherever those flocks were going, they were pooping, and that created energy, that created nutrients for the forest. And with the loss of the passenger pigeons, our forests aren't as healthy as they used to be. They often only live 80, 100 years. They start to get all brittle, and that's why they harvest them at about 80 or 90 years old, because they don't live to be hundreds and thousands of years old the way the old trees did with that nutrient cycling. And another bird that was important in its density in our area in the Potomac was the geese. They were once the upper part of the Potomac, above basically what was now Washington, D.C. The tidal section was called the Potomac. The Indians called the upper section, the free-flowing section, Cahonga-Ruton, which means the river of geese. Ruton means river in Algonquin. Cahon, Cahon. So you could hear the geese calling in the name Cahonga-Ruton. It's an interesting sound that the geese made. But for the Algonquins to call the upper Potomac the river of geese, when they were all over the Chesapeake Bay and everywhere, that they noted this was the one that had the most geese. Our area, we have geese here, and certainly, but I don't think anywhere near the numbers that we used to have. So I just, again, the spelling of Potomac, by the way, Potomac hasn't been spelled P-O-T-O-M-A-C since 1931, when it was the 42 different spellings of Potomac. It was 1931 when Potomac was chosen as the spelling. Okay, with that, it's time to go. Thank everyone for watching and listening. May the future of the Potomac watershed have many old forests again, be full of shad, eels, bison, and elk one more time. Thank you very much.